In this lecture, we'll learn more about how artists use texture, mark, and optical value. And we'll discuss some projects that will get you experimenting with all this. Let's start with 5 drawings. The first, the Bailey still life. The second, the Monet, view of Rouen across the Seine. Third, this Van Gogh landscape. Fourth, this Picasso from the Human Comedy series. And fifth, a Kathy Kollwitz self-portrait. Each has a pronounced textural personality and mood, and this is related to formal and material choices. It would be good to have a sketchbook or some paper on hand. If you've started a sketchbook for mark and texture, use that. It's actually a good idea to have 2 sketchbooks for the purpose, one smooth, the other with a rougher paper. This lets you see how a given drawing tool and technique interacts with surface characteristics. Again, don't worry about drawing objects, just the marks. While all 5 drawings use value, the Bailey's the only one that features much of what we might call shading. And although we sense volume and directional light, it's the softest and most reserved, quiet, no drama. This drawing measures 39.5 by 42 3/8, almost square, the least dramatic of shapes. The directions in the drawing, mostly horizontals and verticals, with a few gentle diagonals. The paper's softly toned, closing down the value range on the light end. As we saw in an earlier lecture, the drawing exists between about a 1.5 and 4 on our value scale. Some of the distinctions we perceive at edges are not always differences of value. Some are differences of color. The paper versus a similar value of graphite. And the mark and texture follow suit, soft, even, without incident. All the choices, from the choice of materials to their handling to compositional decisions, all work together toward the same end, a feeling of quiet, repose, and stability. So make some soft, light, continuous tones with your graphite now. The Picasso's the polar opposite. A horizontal rectangle 9 3/8 by 12.5 inches, with a seemingly endless array of popping and stabbing white, dark gray, and black shapes. While there are some horizontals and verticals, diagonals rule, and the marks, most in high value contrast, cover the page in an active, high volume pattern. So with brush and ink, make some of these Picasso marks. You could spend some real time with this drawing cataloging the wealth of brushstrokes, from those that create the plant's leaves to those creating the patterns on the wall and floor. The Monet is someplace in between the first 2, not as quiet as the Bailey, not so much horizontality and verticality, not as tight a value palette, but not as high volume as the Picasso, none of the diagonal fireworks, and not a single black-white contrast. The sheet of paper, 13 by 19 3/4, is white, lightly tinted blue. It has a slight vertical tooth that serves as an architectural support for the many vertical stresses in the drawing. The drawing was executed with black chalk in a very free, scribbled hand. But because many of the marks sit into tonal grounds of mark of similar value, they don't feel highly contrasted. They give the sense of a gentle breeze in the air. Even the dark boats are partially subsumed in their shadows and reflections, and in the dark banks behind them. The more contrasting scribbled lines of the boat's reflections convey the gentle wave-like surface of the water. With some charcoal or black chalk if you have it, try marks like these, scribbles and scribbles on top of other scribbles. The Van Gogh also occupies a place between the extremes of the Bailey and the Picasso, but it's extreme in its own way, in the invention and deployment of mark. The page is about 19 by 24. The drawing was done with brown ink in various dilutions over black chalk. Overall, the value and scale of mark relate to linear and atmospheric perspective. In a letter to his brother Theo, he wrote, "The 2 views of La Croix are the best things I've done in pen and ink." And indeed, they're both beautiful drawings. The one we're looking at is in the British Museum's collection. The other's in Amsterdam's Van Gogh Museum. Get yourself a good reproduction or download a high-res file of one or both. Give yourself some time to go through them. Make every different mark you can find, and try varying the dilution of ink as you see it. Even in a small section like this, there's plenty to unravel. The Kullwitz is similar in size to the Van Gogh. It's 18¾ by 25, drawn with charcoal on a brown laid Angler paper. Squint. You'll see that the head, arm, and hand all condense into one close value shape. This tells us the value range in the figure is tight, and all similar value in the mid and dark range. The major value contrast occurs between that big value shape and the paper itself. While there's some modeling, it occurs among very proximate values. The top of the cheekbone is just slightly lighter than the side plane. The whites of the eyes, all but indistinguishable from the lids, save for the bit of line separating them. What really distinguishes the arm from the head and hand is not value, but mark-making, visual texture. It creates contrast, telling us that two things are different. The eye and head reveal relatively slow mark. That conveys focus and thought. The mark in the arm, action and movement. The hand, slowed again, though like a hand poised to launch a dart, potential energy. The drawing structure expresses an idea about drawing, that it requires a focused intellect and a steady hand, but also an ability to spring into action. Also note the single linear stroke describing the page or drawing board. That's a poetic choice. You can see how much she's done with the broad side of the charcoal. In fact, look at the stub she holds between her fingers, same width as a zigzag in her arm. Try some of this mark making now. We just reviewed 5 drawings. Expand on this by looking at drawings you love. Get the best resolution reproductions you can. Look at what the drawings are made of, not the people or flowers or buildings, but the marks. Then use similar materials and surfaces at a similar scale and draw the marks, lines, and gradations of value. Then apply what you've learned in your own drawings. Studying materials and surfaces will really help you learn about texture. There are 7 primary factors: the paper or drawing surface, then any modifications made to the paper or drawing surface. 3, the choice of drawing tool. Next, the preparation or modification of the tool. 5th factor, the application method. For example, we could draw directly with compressed charcoal, or we could rub a brush against it and transfer the material to a surface. Next, there's a physical factor, how the mark's physically drawn. That includes the physical position of our bodies and the drawing, hand position, hand motion, and hand pressure. Last, number 7, is modification. This can mean compounding, blending, smearing, smudging, and erasing marks. In combining these 7 factors, the number of textural possibilities is just about infinite. The paper or other drawing surface is our first factor, and there are 3 main sub-factors here: texture, value, and color. As we've noted, papers span a wide variety of surface patterns, both regular and irregular, with textures from very smooth to very rough. As we saw with Seurat, the paper can do a lot of work. Now, Seurat's concern was with the visual texture of the drawing, not with simulating the texture of materials like skin or cloth. But let's say I want to simulate the textures of objects. This is our 3rd way of thinking about texture, often referred to as trompe-l'œil, French for fool the eye. We'll go into more detail about this later. For now, imagine I'm drawing a still life of shiny, reflective objects. A very smooth paper will help. Not only is the smooth paper, well, smooth, but smooth papers are also shinier. They're more reflective. That's because the light's bouncing off an even surface. The surface of a textured paper is made of many different planes reflecting in different directions. This reduces shininess. On the other hand, if I were drawing a landscape, a stormy night sky over a craggy cliff descending into a turbulent sea, a rougher paper might bring out these physical qualities. Surface texture will also affect edges. Less tooth, much easier to control edges and small details. Lots of tooth, harder to get precise details, but easier to get fuzzier edges. Let's say I'm doing a detailed study of a branch and some leaves. Smooth paper will readily allow me to be as precise as I want. But if I were drawing the same branch on a tree in a forested area in the distance, A more textured surface could well help me create the sense of a mass of foliage. As we've already noted, it's the tooth that pulls the material off the drawing implement and holds it on the surface. And this can affect how dark the material will look. With the same material and the same pressure applied, a toothier paper can create a darker value than a smooth one. This is Willow Charcoal on Strathmore 500 series Bristol plate, a very smooth paper. This is the same charcoal on a Strathmore 500 Bristol Vellum, a much rougher paper. And here's some graphite on the smooth plate and on the rougher vellum. The difference in value is apparent. You can modify a portion of a paper surface to make it smoother or rougher. To make it smoother, burnish. You can use the back of a spoon, the side of a butter knife, or even a dense eraser. This is something called a bone folder. It's used to fold paper in bookmaking and origami. Works for burnishing too. Whatever you use, test it first to make sure it won't leave any marks. This is the rougher paper, the Strathmore 500 Bristol Vellum. Do a little burnishing and you see the effect. You can also roughen a surface. I'm using a piece of 220 grit sandpaper. Note the difference in the look of the graphite on the roughened area. Along with paper, the textures we get will have everything to do with the drawing material we use. Each creates unique textures. And each material is complex. With a set of pencils spanning 10B to 10H, you have 22 different drawing tools right there. Like paper, drawing materials have their own textural characteristics. Graphite's shiny, it reflects light. The family of carbon and charcoals is comparatively matte. So, back to that still life of shiny reflective objects, or a drawing that I want to have an overall shiny or reflective texture. Drawing with graphite on a smooth paper would be reasonable. The materials have that built in. On the other hand, if I were drawing the stormy night sky over a craggy cliff descending into a turbulent sea, charcoal on a rougher paper would be a reasonable choice. Now, that's not to say that it would be wrong to draw each of these subjects with the other set of materials. It's just that they'll feel different. More reflective or more matte, smoother or more jagged, crisper or more atmospheric. And these characteristics are at the heart of how a drawing feels. So in choosing materials, consider the feel of what you're going for. A further factor is drawing tool preparation or modification. We learned a number of ways to shape a pencil's tip: pointed, flattened, or turned into a wedge. Each of these creates different textures. On the wet media side, we can dilute the ink or partially dry the brush before applying it to the surface, and we can use different brush shapes and types of bristle. Then there's the method of application. We can apply material directly, or we can also apply many materials indirectly. We've already seen that we can rub the graphite or charcoal with a tortillon, a blending stub, a brush, or a chamois, and then apply it to the surface. Artists use many other tools as applicators, like felt, facial tissue, paper towel, cotton swabs, and makeup sponges. Many other things you have around the house can be used too. Each will create a somewhat different texture. A variation is to apply the material to an intermediary surface, then rub some felt or similar tool on the intermediary surface and transfer it to the drawing. As you've seen, you can also create a powder from some materials and transfer that to the surface. With wet media, the range of application tools is extremely varied. There are brushes of all sizes, shapes, and textures, from soft, small pointed rounds to short, hard bristled ones, to medium-sized wedge shapes, to much larger brushes. And there are countless types of nibs, and even a chopstick, or any stick for that matter, can be used to apply wet media. That same stick, brushed against an old toothbrush, can be used to create splattering marks. You may want to mask areas when doing this. And no reason not to draw directly with the toothbrush. Many tools can be used to flick wet media across the page. Sponges of all kinds will make many other types of textures possible. and blotter or other absorbent materials can be used to modify wet media on the surface. Not to forget the Elan Cave and Chuck Close's portraits, hands and fingers can be put to great use too. You've likely seen the next technique in a 1940s detective film. The bad guy receives a call. He writes down a phone number on a pad, tears off the top sheet, and runs out the door. The detective jimmies the lock, rubs a pencil over the blank sheet, and the incised telephone number emerges, white against black. So let's say you want a thin white edge in an otherwise dark ground, maybe the highlight on a piece of molding. Put a sheet of tracing paper over the drawing. With a sharpened pencil or stick, incise a line in the tracing paper surface with enough pressure to create a groove in the underlying sheet. Apply value, and the white line emerges. Best to know where you want that line, but if you want to get rid of it, try filling in. Whatever the surrounding dark is, get a well-sharpened version and work it into the groove, then blend with a pointed tortillon or stump. You can create all kinds of white on black patterns this way, hatchings, scribbles, really anything you can draw with line. The next factor involves the way the mark is made physically. First off is a position of the surface in relation to the body. The page could be flat on a desk or other surface, or the page could be in a vertical position on an easel. The page's position is related to the joint of motion. We can move from the shoulder, from the elbow, from the wrist, from the fingers. At the desk, people tend to draw at a smaller scale using elbow, wrist, and fingers. Standing at an easel, shoulder, elbow, and wrist is more common. Then there's hand position. With the paper on a horizontal surface, we can hold the hand the way we write, or palm the implement for a different range of movement. With the drawing surface in a vertical position, we can hold it something like a scalpel or underhand. There are many possibilities. Each will give us a different range of motion and suggest different kinds of mark and texture. Note how particularly Kathy Kulwitz holds her charcoal. Of course, one could hold the implement in one's mouth or between one's toes, and people have done both. More commonly, people draw with their non-dominant hand, this often in an effort to arrive at freer-looking, more random marks and textures, all worth trying. Our last two physical factors are hand motion and hand pressure. I can create an area of mark vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. I can use a circular motion or a figure eight. I can move my hand in small increments or large increments. I can apply a continuous pressure for an even tone or a discontinuous pressure for an uneven one. Once we have some marks on the surface, we can modify it in many ways, and the number of textural possibilities really skyrockets as we begin to layer, combine, blend, smudge, smear, and erase. Exploring this could fill hundreds of sketchbooks over many years. The simplest way to modify a mark is with some kind of compound texture using the same tool. For instance, I can create a tonal swatch with charcoal. Then, using the same charcoal, mark into it in a contrasting way. Or I could create a tonal swatch with charcoal, then mark into it with a carbon pencil, or graphite, or ink, or any of these and any others in any combinations. And I could mark on top of these with an eraser. First a pencil type, then the kneaded. It's endless. When we combine materials, we want to be aware of their native characteristics. Pay attention to how the order of application affects the way they appear on a given surface. Graphite's slick. Many materials won't adhere to it well. Easier to put graphite on top of charcoal or ink than vice versa. But no harm in trying unlikely combinations. Make swatches. Label them so you know what you've done. Then there's a whole world to be discovered in blending, smearing, and smudging. We've talked about 9 tools we can use for the purpose. The tortillon, the blending stub, brushes, a chamois, a piece of felt, facial tissue, paper towels, cotton swabs, and makeup sponges. So start with 9 swatches of a given material. Here I've used vine charcoal. First blend, then smear, then apply. Now do the same with each of the remaining tools. You could also experiment by repeating the same test on a contrasting paper. And you could try using multiple tools on the same swatch. There's an unlimited amount to discover here. Each week, choose a material, say an 8B pencil or an 8H. Run it through its paces. Over time, you'll develop a very intimate sense of what each of your material does alone, in combination, and subject it to various modifications. So, let's talk about our third type of texture, simulated or trompe-l'oeil texture. Over the years, I've had students ask, how do you do metal, or rocks, or water? Reasonable enough, they all have different textures. But for most purposes, it's of limited practicality to learn a recipe for each. There's too much variety. Metal could be shining stainless steel, rusted iron, or bent aluminum. Rock could be a sheer cliff or polished marble. And water could be in a pitcher at lunch or in the ocean at night. The way each material looks is affected by a host of factors, like spatial location and light. A distant tree reveals much less of its bark surface texture than one up close, and will see more or less texture depending on the position, distance, and strength of the light source. And we have to relate the way we draw anything to the overall compositional hierarchy and mood of the drawing. So it's of limited use to say, for tree bark, use a 2B pencil on its side on a rough paper. That said, there are ways we can study specific textures, and we'll look at wood grain and reflective metal. I've mentioned that many artists and professors say that learning to draw is all about learning to see, and that's certainly the case here. We need to determine the distinguishing visual characteristics of a subject at a given distance in a given light source. If we can relate that to specific drawing materials and procedures, we'll be in good shape to proceed. In drawing simulated textures, start simply. Do a study, not a full-blown drawing. Don't try to create an entire still life, just one texture that you're interested in learning about. We'll look at wood grain first. If you were doing this on your own, you'd want to get a piece of wood with an interesting pattern of grain. The first step's analysis. The goal is to determine the underlying visual characteristics of the subject. With certain textures, a black and white photo of the object can help you see the underlying characteristics more clearly, or making a rubbing or a photocopy. All three have a lot less visual data than the objects themselves, and this can work to your advantage in trying to distill a principle. Here, the black and white shows you how you could lay down a pretty consistent ground of value, then using a darker, more or less vertical mark, draw the echoing grain shapes, all the while paying attention to the spacing and proportion. And that's pretty much the way Magritte draws his wood grain in this celebration of texture and mark, though the values are lighter, more high key. So give it a try. Try graphite on a fairly smooth paper, and then on a more textured one, and then try different grains. Let's take a look at a very different kind of texture, a reflective surface. You'll need an empty paint can from the hardware store or something similar. Highly polished reflective surfaces like mirrors produce reflections with sharp edges. The less polished the metal, the fuzzier the edges. The can you find may be more or less polished. This one is by no means the dullest metal, but it's much less polished than a mirror. The edges are gauzier. Whatever the case, when looking at reflective surfaces, it's helpful to understand what's being reflected instead of just trying to copy a random pattern of lights and darks. So let's sort this out. To control the reflection, I'll place the can in a cardboard box. Let's start on the left. The yellowish vertical band is the reflection of the left flap folded into the box's interior. The band's lighter toward the interior of the can. That's the reflection of the close edge of the flap. It gets gradually and slightly darker toward the left edge of the can, representing the flap receding into the box. Then we get a thin dark stripe, the reflection of the much darker backplane of the box. We see something similar on the right side, though the reflected flap's darker. That's because I've lit the can from the right side and the right flap's in shadow. You'll also note that light from the can gets reflected back onto the right flap. The bright vertical stripe to the left of the flap's reflection is a reflection of the light shining from the right. Let's look at the curving edge, yellowish to whitish, near the base of the can in the center. That's the reflection of the front edge of the box reflected into the curving can. It disappears into the light's reflection. The curving edge above it, lightish to darkish, is the reflection of the table's edge meeting the much darker room. The blur behind would be me, my camera, and tripod. The next couple pieces are a little harder to see because the contrast is low, so I put some white foam core inside the box to heighten this. The receding diagonal of the bottom flap reflects as a curve. Same thing on the other side. And the cast shadow of the flap onto the box's floor plane reflects too. Knowing what's going on, I think you'll be able to make out these relationships in the original version. It really all boils down to seeing the shapes and value of what's being reflected. Several years ago, I had a grad student who got interested in reflective surfaces and did a group of drawings and paintings of a paint can. This, a very iconic example. Before starting your own drawing, think about what material and paper you want to use and do some tests. Experiment with your blending tools and erasers to approximate the quality of the edges and the reflection. Then do a couple of compositional sketches to figure out placement and format shape. Then analyze what you're seeing and draw. It's a great situation to play with and create variations. Other kinds of objects positioned to reflect in the can be interesting. Try an egg or a lemon or a bottle. Then move the can out of the box onto your still life table so it reflects the room. Dissect what's happening. The box is like a simple room, so you have some preparation for the complexity of an actual room. Or put the can on a wood grain tabletop, or on something reflective, like a mirror or metal baking sheet. You could make all the surfaces in your setup reflective. Or use a piece of pattern material. Stripes are interesting. You could apply the same methods of analysis we used in looking at wood grain or reflective surfaces to rock, fur, water in a glass, or anything that piques your interest. Varying materials is another way to explore texture. It's a great project to draw the same thing, same size, composition, lighting, but change the paper and drawing material. For instance, try graphite on a smooth paper, then on a rough paper. I think you get the idea. A little foreshadowing here. My grad student who did the paint cans actually did many of these in color, our next topic. And this will be a great project to remember and reprise after we've covered some color basics. Returning to texture, remember it's all about the feel and look and even the smell of the piece. Van Gogh was very aware of all of this. He wrote to his brother Theo in April of 1885 about the painting he was working on, The Potato Eaters. He wrote this: "I've tried to bring out the idea that these people eating potatoes by the light of their lamp have dug the earth with the self-same hands they're now putting into the dish, and it thus suggests manual labor and a meal honestly earned." He goes on to talk about the texture of the painting in terms of weaving. I'd love to know if he was aware of the etymological connection. He writes, "I've held the threads of this fabric in my hands all winter long and searched for the definitive pattern. And although it is now a fabric of rough and coarse appearance, the threads have now been chosen with care and according to certain rules. It would be wrong to give a painting of peasant life a conventional polish. If a peasant painting smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, fine. A painting of peasant life should not be perfumed."